I'm pleased to be here. I don't have a a formal lecture of any kind. I just have some remarks to make because Anya had asked me to think about the right of return and the law of return. How do we think about those two things together? The right of return for Palestinians to lands that were dispossessed and stolen, the 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 law of return, which has been part of Israeli law since 1950, which allows Jews throughout the world to elect to go to Israel and become citizens on the basis of being Jewish. Um, so, to talk about this, we have to think about the fact that one's a right of return that was made possible for Palestinians. I mean, it was proclaimed by a UN resolution um, and in December of 1948. And the law of return, which became part of Israeli law, uh, was was passed in 1950. Um, so these are two concepts that came into being within 2 years of one another, and within 2 years of the establishment of the State of Israel and the Nakba. So they have different legal status immediately. What's international law? Here we're in Brussels. What's international law? um, uh, in any case, I thought it might be interesting just to note that there are actually two exceptions to the right of return that uh, those of the law of return that those of us who are Jewish have to that permits us to become citizens of the State of Israel. A Jew is not welcome if he or she is engaged in activity against the Jewish people, or is a threat to public health, or has a criminal past. And all of those categories can be widely interpreted. Okay. So as some of you are thinking about renouncing your um, your entitlement to return to the State of Israel as a Jewish person, you should ask whether the State of Israel would have you. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So that law of return extends a right to Jews to return to the land of Israel as if it was their home, and it is the place from which they come. It argues that it's their rightful home. It offers it as a rightful home, and it also, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, in the way that it's talked about, understands the diaspora as a fallen place, the galut. So when you go back to the State of Israel, which is ostensibly your home if you are a Jew, you are rising out of this fallen state of the galut. And the aliyah, which some people make, which means migrating to Israel, actually has that sense of ascent or rising. Okay, I see that we have beautiful skeptical expression on somebody's face. There's also the idea that the Jewish people were forced to scatter, and that the aim of Jewish history is to reassemble them into a unity and on that land, and so reunify a scattered people, but also to lift them up from their fallen and scattered position. Now, I don't mind being fallen and scattered, but maybe you do. Okay, but we can talk about that. Some people cite biblical sources that justify the law of return. Of course, we know that there is the Jewish people and the land of the Jewish people, both linked together in biblical language. But there's also, of course, a very clear Zionist aim, and I think we could see that in the 1950 law that made the law of return possible. And that is to maintain a demographic advantage for Jews on that land, and to continue to reproduce the Jewish population in order to avert the possibility of Jews becoming a minority on that land, a land they consider to be their own. And then, of course, there's a third argument, and that's one that we hear perhaps most recently, which is that Jews are only safe in the state of Israel. Oi, I have to say. Safe there? Really? Okay. Jews are only safe in the state of Israel. This was, of course, the appeal made to French Jews most recently by Netanyahu in the wake of some anti-Semitic attacks in France. So it's important to ask how the law of return is communicated to the Jewish diaspora and for what reasons. And there's a group, I don't know if it operates in Europe, but it certainly operates in the United States, called Birthright. You have it here?
Yeah.
You have it everywhere?
Yeah.
Oh, they are so powerful. Mm-hmm. And they appeal to young people starting at the age of 13, 14, 15, young Jewish people to say, hey, we are going to pay a ticket for you to come to Israel, and you will learn all about your tradition, and you will have your Jewish identity intensified. And of course, they have a very specific kind of history that they tell. And if you contest the history that they tell, one that does not actually elaborate on the Nakba at all, you are shunned or disciplined or possibly expelled. And I've met with several people who were expelled from the group. They took that free ticket, and then they were expelled from the group. And now there's a wonderful group of people who decided that they were being given propaganda on that particular trip, and it's called Birthright Unplugged. And they're a radical group, and they have a fabulous website. And they're linked with Jewish Voice for Peace, and they're linked with a number of other organizations, and they go around actually exposing what the strategy is. And what the strategy is, of course, is trying to get people to imagine making aliyah and migrating to Israel and reproducing that Jewish demographic advantage. I mean, one problem with that group, and that group is, I think, important for us to consider, is that it establishes the history and value of Zionism and also teaches that the only way to have a strong Jewish identity is to embrace the Zionist project. That if you don't embrace Zionism, that you don't really feel the intensity of Jewishness. And intensity is important. It's a word that's used in order to, look who's here. Welcome. In any case, it does seem that it links Jewish values, Jewish identity, and the intensity of Jewish experience to the acceptance of a Zionist history and a Zionist project. It doesn't, what's interesting, of course, is that the law of return doesn't really care whether you've been strongly identified as a Jew, whether you've gone to synagogue, whether you know Jewish history. You could not know you're a Jew and find out you're a Jew and still be eligible. You could simply be born a Jew without having any Jewish education or Jewish self-understanding, and you would still be eligible for citizenship. It would still be understood to be your home, and the fact of being Jewish ties you to the land and gives you a right to the land. And I think that this is a really important way that that the law of return operates. It actually makes the idea of being part of the people belonging to the land. It tries to meld those two separate concepts together. Of course, these programs, for the most part, target white middle-class Jews. So they seek to bring white middle-class Jews with money and racial privilege to Israel, not just to reproduce the demographic advantage for Jews, but the white demographic advantage for Jews. I don't see them making strong claims on the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of Arab descent, nor do I see them really going after Sephardic communities. So that's, and it's also a way, I believe, to establish strong cultural and political ties between the state of Israel and the United States, and very possibly major European countries as well. So I want to stop for a moment on the question of Sephardic Jews, because as you may know, and I'm sure you do, some of you here have been in this world of debate and scholarship much longer than I have. The interesting situation with Sephardic Jews is complicated, since many Sephardic Jews living outside of Spain who were forced out of Spain under the Inquisition actually have a right of return, and that sets a precedent actually for the Palestinian right of return, because precisely because they were forcibly expelled. Diasporic Sephardim who can document their histories, that their families did come from Spain, are given an advantage in applying for citizenship to Spain and hence the European Union, and they can't go back to the very same house or the very same lands from which they were dispossessed, but they can get an advantage in achieving Spanish citizenship. And the Spanish government that set this up understood itself to be under an obligation to interpret the right of return. In other words, they're not returning to the exact same land, the exact same place, the exact same time, but they are welcome back, and there is a sense of returning as someone new, as part of that generation. Now, in my experience, in trying to talk to people about the right of return for Palestinians, I have found that it raises all kinds of enormous fears. Even, the great Shulamit Aloni said to me, what, they're going to come into our kitchens and take our spatulas out of our hands? It's like, no, Shulamit, that's not what it's about. Anyway. I just remember her going, she was great, but it was a hard notion for her. She had a really hard time, and she was a fabulous leftist socialist, right, who was really thinking in the most progressive way that she could during the time that she was living, and we miss her. But people say, well, the right of return, it would be a flood, it would be the end of the Jewish state. They would come back and try to take our homes away. And there's just enormous anxiety about it. And in fact, when you stop and actually think about how other countries and other places have handled the right of return, that is in several legal systems, a right that is accorded to those who have been forcibly dispossessed of their lands and forced and subject to forced transfer, right? International Criminal Court makes it clear. So the group Zachrot, that many of you probably know, it's a small group that's been struggling in Tel Aviv. They had two different map projects, and maybe you've seen their mapping projects online. One of them were maps of destruction, where they went around and documented the destruction of Palestinian villages. And they not only made those maps and displayed those maps in galleries in Tel Aviv, but they also went to those villages and built small monuments in an effort to acknowledge the destruction that happened there. They also have a second project, one that's called Counter Mapping Return, and someone, after they came out with this project, their offices were burned. There was a fire in their offices, and they were attacked personally. It was unbelievable. What it was a collaborative project between Jews and Palestinians that considered the environmental implications and the practical dimensions of what resettlement projects would be, where they would take place, how what it would mean for the dissolution of current settlements and how those lands could be restructured, what the environmental conditions are, what the local forms of joint governance would be. And they actually built maps and architectural plans for several villages that would be positioned throughout the West Bank and 48, and they were incredibly precise. They were displayed in Tel Aviv in 2010 and 11, and they included various cultural and educational institutions, medical and rehabilitative facilities, nothing like what the refugees in Lebanon have ever seen. So, against those who simply claim this is impossible, it's impractical, it would be a flood, it would be unstructured, it would be overwhelming, they actually thought it out detail by detail, and they who thought it out was a collaborative group of Israelis and Palestinians who worked together to think about what would be the concrete ways to cohabit together, to govern together, and also for those who've been forcibly transferred out of those lands to come back and to build a different future. So it is about mapping the future. They had two maps. One was the mapping of the destruction of the past, which has been radically elided in the histories that are told in the state of Israel. They mapped what has been lost, but they also mapped what could be possible. Two different mapping projects. I think it's pretty fabulous. And both of them made use of Herbert Marcuse's idea of what is negatively present, right? What is negatively present. Like, this destruction doesn't show on the surface. The destruction of Palestinian villages, it doesn't show, but we can make it show. We can make it negatively present through these maps and through these monuments. This future of cohabitation doesn't exist on the surface. We can't find it anywhere in our actual lives, but we can imagine it into existence. It's a radical place for imaginative action, but also architecture, practical, and politics, modes of governance. Okay, so so they made the right of return for Palestinians very practical. They drew up the plans for new communities, the dismantling of settlements, that was fun, the emergence of new housing structures and bilingual communities, bilingual education. That sounded like a great idea. Modeled actually on modes of integrated housing, racially integrated housing projects from the US, but also on collective governance, and trying also, and of course they were massively threatened and attacked and their offices burned, but they persisted and they still are having a hard time, but they persist. Now, the right of return for Palestinians was claimed by the United Nations in its Resolution 194 in December of 1948, and it claims the following: refugees wishing to return to their homes and live in peace should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. That was 1950. For those not wishing to return, they would receive compensation for loss of property. So let's remember that the right of return always held out the possibility that compensation could be a possibility. People don't, they think the right of return is very literal. They're going to come back and take this house, this spatula, this. I mean, especially the spatula, you know. But the thing is that, in fact, reparation is possible. Acknowledgement is part of the right of return. The right of return doesn't have to, it could be coming back to make a future life that doesn't look anything like that past life. It could be, which is the Zochrot possibility. It could be reparation. It could be acknowledgement. All three of those dimensions belong to the right of return. Now, the right of return is part of international law. Even at the time, 1950, it referenced prior international law in the resolution itself, and it was an explicit acknowledgement of the massive dispossession of people from their homes and lands. And since then, the International Criminal Court has said time and again deportation and forced population transfer are both crimes against humanity and are in need of reparation. The right of return is there for refugees. It's even there for Syrian refugees. How that will ever happen, I'm not sure. The descendants of Palestinians dispossessed in the Nakba now number close to 7 million. At the time they were, some people say 700,000 or 800,000 or 900,000, but now we've got close to 7 million. And 500,000 of those live in Lebanon alone, living in 12 separate camps with very rudimentary services and fully compromised rights of mobility and ownership and no rights of citizenship. So let us note as well that many of the Syrians who are coming into Lebanon now, and we know that Lebanon is taking more Syrian refugees than any other country, many of those Syrians are also Palestinians. Okay. So for many years, Palestinians have not been allowed to own or bequeath property in Lebanon. So it's clear that Palestinians don't have basic rights in the neighboring countries. And of course, we should be appalled by the fact that Jordan does not help, that Lebanon does not help. We should be appalled by the fact that the Arab states have not helped to assimilate and enfranchise the Palestinians in the ways that they should. But I think that we would make a mistake by using the radical injustice that the Arab states have shown towards the Palestinians to let Israel off the hook from correcting a radical injustice that it itself committed. In other words, if we say, oh, the right of return, it wouldn't be a problem if the Arab states would just absorb these people, right? But these people come from Palestine. These people have their home there. This is their land. So even though the Arab states are to be faulted for sure, that does not mean that Israel ought not to meet its obligation under the UN. So, in my mind, at least, the Palestinians in Lebanon are entitled to a right to return, and that would, of course, be a nightmare for the current Israeli government, or maybe even any conceivable Israeli government in the present, and certainly for the Zionist project as it's currently defined, since it does require that demographic advantage for Jews, and that is a way of keeping Jews in the majority, and it is a racial distinction which produces a radical inequality on the basis, and I'm going to call it race, not because I think Palestinians are a race or Jews are a race, but because racialization is the name of that kind of radical institution of inequality. So people who may not be racialized in other domains of life or in other parts of history get racialized when they are subject to that kind of radical inequality. So trying to control the population on the basis of who's Jewish and who's not produces this situation where the demographic advantage has to be reproduced and reproduced. And if it weren't for demographic advantage, I wonder whether the right of return could be more openly considered. If Israel were to become a state where Jews and Palestinians and Arabs more generally live together on the basis of equality and demographic advantage was given up, maybe it would still be a Jewish state, but it would express the Jewish values of cohabitation. It would express the Jewish values of equality. It would express the Jewish values of radical equality and radical justice. In any case, that's my thing. But here, I want to say this as well, that we can't think about the right of return in the abstract, like, oh, what would it be for Israel to try to absorb all these Palestinians, or how many would want to return, and what would it be overwhelming, and what would happen to the nature of the culture, etc. The problem isn't just that. The problem is the unresolved issue of Palestinian refugees, most radically, I would say, in Lebanon. Right? That remains unresolved because there is no right of return, in part. And the obligation to consider the right of return seems to me to follow from the absolute necessity to find a just solution for the refugee problem and an enfranchisement of all those stateless people. Now, there are at least two projects that I know of that are like the project that Anya has talked to me about, and that has to do with Jews getting together and giving up their own rights to return under the law of return. And I myself signed such a petition some years ago, and that was authored by Amy Kaplan, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And there are different ways of thinking about it. Some people say the biblical and the legal grounds for the law of return are specious and should be opposed. Another is slightly different. A British group said this: well, some of us might want to live in Israel, but when Palestinians are not accorded equal rights, we don't want to live there under those conditions. So we give up our right to become Israeli citizens until there is radical equality. There, the refusal to exercise the right under present conditions is different from a full renunciation of the right, meaning it should have never been my right to begin with. Even under ideal circumstances, it should not be my right. I have no claim to that land. All right, so that's a different claim. I think it's a more radical claim. Okay, so it may be, we also have another problem, which is that we're discussing the possibility of renouncing the Jewish right to return under conditions in which the state of Israel may well deny that right, given that it is now denying visitation privileges to Israel for all of us who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, right? So the Knesset has passed this law, and those who support the boycott will not be allowed in the country. And immediately afterwards, I noted that a number of people were not allowed in the country who don't support the boycott, right? But who are just critical of the state of Israel. So it's already expanded in practice. It's already expanded in practice. And this is a very, very serious issue. So what does it mean to renounce a right to gain citizenship in a state when that state would deny you that citizenship in any case? And given the recent Knesset legislation, many of us will be disallowed from even visiting. And if we cannot visit, we can hardly make aliyah. And that law has been extended, as I said, to all kinds of critics, and it strikes me as a much more profound problem since it affects all kinds of people, including Palestinians from the diaspora who wish to maintain familial ties or ties of solidarity. It keeps them from getting to Palestine. And of course, it is also very devastating, this law, for Palestinian movements, including prisoners' rights movements that depend on international workers who may well have criticisms of Israel or accept the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The educational ties between Birzeit University and other Palestinian universities to many people throughout the world who do honor the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, that those are also radically undermined by this current law. So I think it's important to think about renouncing one's eligibility to return to Israel as a Jew. I do, but I think that there are also some other issues we have to be thinking about, because what's really happening is an effort to keep to censor dissent and to criminalize critique. And that's become very, very frightening, both for those who are already living there and those on the outside who have great investments in what happens there. So maybe as we're renouncing our capacity to gain citizenship, we should also be contesting that ban, and maybe also struggling to get Jordan and Egypt to exercise greater power over those borders, because, as you know, there is collaboration at all those borders, and there is no way to enter into the state of Israel, or there's no way to enter into Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza. You cannot enter into either one of those areas without passing through Israel, even if it's just the checkpoint. The checkpoint is Israel. And if you're not allowed into Israel, you're not allowed there. There's no separate way. And you would think Jordan would make a way, or you'd think Egypt would make a way. In any case. I'm also thinking that we, for those of us who are worried about this area, I'm particularly worried about the new white supremacy that's in the White House, that has made anti-Semitism acceptable, especially when it's coupled with Zionism. And we have in Steve Bannon someone who is an anti-Semite and openly hosts and supports anti-Semitic groups on his website, and has been allied with a number of those groups, and he's welcome in the state of Israel. Why? Because he supports Zionism. So you can be an anti-Semite and a Zionist and be welcome, and being a Zionist is more important. I mean, and it's of course very confusing for those of us who are not Zionists or have strong criticisms of Zionism, because we are called anti-Semites, which is very painful. It's been painful for years. I mean, I barely know how to handle that accusation. I hate it so much. But it's so interesting. It's like, oh, it was never the case that they actually thought that we hated Jews, or that we had some deep animus against Jews, or that we held to stereotypes, or that we were in favor of discrimination against Jews. It was never that they really thought we were anti-Semitic in any of those senses. They had started to define anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism, and in fact, it's the only definition that they're accepting right now. Okay. In any case, what would it do to sign this resolution? Well, for those of you who are Jewish, it means, and are not Israeli citizens, to say that you would not make use of your right to become an Israeli citizen. It's an individual act. You're talking for yourself. You're speaking for yourself. It's a strong act. You might say, oh, it's too individualistic. Well, it's not if you're doing it with other people. If you're doing it with other people, then there's a community of people that says there are another set of values than those that Jews have than those that are presently represented by the Israeli state. There are other sets of Jewish values, and Jews value other things than what the Israeli state values. It's a refusal to affiliate. And it's extremely important, as the Israeli state says, that it represents the Jewish people all the time. That it doesn't even have to say it rightly represents all the Jewish people, because it claims it is the representative body for the Jewish people. So if we're going to drive a wedge into that claim and say, no, you do not represent the Jewish people, here we are representing ourselves, and in ways that are in defiance of the values that you are saying are Jewish values, Zionist values, then we show that the Jewish people are not one, they're not a monolith, they have a wide range of views, and many of them are very critical, and that there's a tradition of social justice and dissent in secular and religious Judaism that we can mobilize in order to make clear that the Israeli state does not stand for us and that we do not belong to it. It speaks to Jews, but it also speaks to non-Jews and makes plain that one has to act from clear principle. Also, what it does is it asks the world to consider what the law of return means for Jews when there is no right of return for Palestinians, and to actually allow that to be an injustice and a contradiction. How do you mobilize that right when the other right is denied? It cannot be the case. So, although some people would say, I would like Palestinians and Jews to be treated equally on that land, the truth is, who can return to that land? Who can be a citizen of that land? Who can belong to a state that provides citizenship for Palestinians and Jews both? And in fact, Palestinians cannot do that. At least not those who are in the diaspora. So to sign such a statement would be, I believe, a refusal of complicity, a refusal to be silent. It would be your own voice, but it would also be many voices at the same time. And the good news is that it could become contagious. Yeah. So, I don't know, do you think I could sign?
We'll talk about a staged moment.
Would you like me to sign now?
I would love you to sign. So, but maybe, yes, sorry. But maybe I should say first, so the group that is in fact launching this campaign next month, which will be connected to the 50 years of the occupation, is a group that the official name is Open Network for Jews of Justice, and 1JJ. And basically, this is a group that is from several different European countries, and I'm not sure how many. I'm looking at our headquarters telling me. The numbers are growing, but I'm not sure the exact numbers. And we're also trying to reach out to different progressive Jewish groups across the globe, so we're trying to spread it. And so the first campaign that we will be launching in the upcoming weeks is Reject the Israeli Law of Return. So this is here the certificate. And the idea, indeed, is to not have an individual voice, but to really try to have it spread and shared and make it a collective project, because politics, as good Arendtians we know, are always projects of plurality. So yes, so we are going to ask you if you wouldn't mind reading this.
Okay.
And then signing it. And we also would like to say, I'm sorry, I'm giving the pen here. So we have brochures in the back if anybody's interested. If there's anybody else who feels called this evening to sign, whether privately or in front of the camera, this would be a moment, a pleasure, an honor. And then after we do this, we're going to have questions and answer and discussion time. I am going to ask, not that you don't deserve an applause.
No, I don't need applause.
We don't applause because there's a beautiful, really precious, beautiful baby sleeping in the back. So we're going to not have an applause. And the father is the one filming. Yes, excellent. Yes, so I'm going to pass this to you and ask you to.
Okay. All right. So here it is. It's Reject the Israeli Law of Return. And so for me, it would be I, Judith Butler, as a Jew and citizen of the United States, which is its own problem, reject Israel's law of return. This law offers me Israeli citizenship. I cannot accept this offer as long as Palestinian refugees are denied any right to return to their home. Why? My Jewish identity affirms justice, diversity, equality, and the value of all human lives. This unjust Israeli law further contributes to the asymmetrical conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and thus prevents the possibility of a just peace. The State of Israel does not represent all Jews of the world, nor the profound tradition of Jewish ethics. Oh, I'm signing that. Very happy to sign it.